This is the strategy inside everything. I'm Adam Pierno. The Strategy Inside Everything is the podcast for people who think for a living. All right, welcome back to another episode of The Strategy Inside Everything. I am excited to introduce today's guest, Jamin Warren. He is founder and CEO of 256 in Los Angeles. Jamin, how are you?
I'm doing good. Doing good. It's been raining here a ton, so doing quite well.
Are you a pro rain person, or are you like hiding in your basement, like avoiding the seventh sign of the apocalypse when it rains in LA?
I'm a big rain person. I like outdoor plants, and just it makes like hiking here really nice. So hopefully it will stick around for a while and it won't go immediately to 110 degrees.
I know.
We'll see.
I know. People here have been complaining about the cold in Phoenix too, and I'm like, it's only 60 days from you complaining about the heat. I think you should chill.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, let's enjoy wearing a jacket.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm pumped. So, Jamin, there's a lot I want to talk to you about and tap into your expertise for. But before we do that, can you give people a sense of, how your career has evolved and where you began the journey with 256?
Yeah, absolutely. I began my professional career at the Wall Street Journal, initially covering arts and entertainment for them. The timing worked out really well for me. I was writing about music at that time. The Journal was doing more culture reporting, and they needed somebody to cover entertainment more broadly. Me and another guy named John Jurgensen, who's still there at the paper covering entertainment for them.
Nice.
And the timing also was really interesting because I had been someone who had played video games my entire life. I played a ton in college, for example, and in a professional context, I never imagined that would be something that I would be interested in. I didn't have any aspirations to go into the video game industry, for example, like a lot of people do. But the timing was really interesting. So this is 2007, 2008. And there was a ton that was happening in and about the video game space that, in retrospect, I realized was a real watershed moment for the games industry writ large. You had the releases of three big major consoles, the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and probably more notably the Nintendo Wii, which introduced this whole new audience of people to video games, people who had not played video games for quite some time. But you also had the introduction of app stores on things like mobile devices, for example. So Apple releases its app store. You have Angry Birds. You also have, a lot of the games that are popular right now were started around that time as well. So Roblox, I believe, like 12, 13 years old. Minecraft, that's a 2008, 2009 title. So you had so many things that were happening in and about the world of games. And so I went to my editor and I was like, hey, I should be writing about video games the same way I'm writing about other forms of arts and culture. And my editor, unfortunately, was like, I don't get this video games thing. You should go write about TV. And like any disgruntled 20-something, I was like, I'll start my own magazine.
Here we go. I'll teach you, editor.
Yeah, exactly.
I love it.
Exactly. I'm more sympathetic in retrospect. I'm more sympathetic to my editor's position because he was thinking about his audience, and it wasn't a space that that he knew super well, and so he's thinking through a lens of this is like 15 years ago, so he's thinking about an audience that's in their 50s and 60s, and I'm 25, and so I totally get it. But I left and I started Kill Screen, which is an independent media company. We did a magazine and website. We did the first ever arcade at the Museum of Modern Art. We did partnerships with companies like Pitchfork, and that was a lovely business. I loved doing it. It was just very difficult to do financially. I think like a lot of mid to late aughts digital media folks, independent media folks, is just incredibly hard to
I remember reading about it at the time, and that sounds amazing. It sounds like exactly what you were trying to do with the Wall Street Journal, and you did it.
Yeah.
Without them.
Yeah, exactly. So, it was a wonderful period of time. And because I was in New York, it's interesting because I was in New York at that time, we started getting a lot of calls from brands and agencies that were interested in gaming, and they didn't really know what to do. So they would reach out to me. And at the time, I didn't really have a structure set up to help service them. So, I could give a talk, or you could buy advertising, but we started 256 actually when I moved out here to Los Angeles in 2017. as a strategic consultancy to help brands do exactly that, reach gaming. Back to my old editor's thoughts, I don't get that video game thing. That's something that we often hear from clients. Although the big change is, I think, like intellectually, I find a lot less resistance to the idea that games are a big deal. That used to be more of a thing. I'd have to do these like more evangelistic pushes for like, hey, you should be paying attention to games.
You'd have to demonstrate the scale by showing
Yeah,
like the amount of dollars raised by people buying
exactly.
a title on a console versus a film that we think as a mass entertainment.
Exactly. And I learned a lot from that experience. I find, numbers are not really the way to a person's changing someone's mind. Like you can
No.
show them all kinds of charts, up and to the right and up and to the right. And it's like it doesn't resonate in the same way. But I think the big change has been two things. One is generational. So, I turned 40 last year, and there's a big generational gap between as gaming is concerned. I mean, with many things,
Yeah.
customers are sort of millennial Gen X customers are sort of on the edge of both things. But people younger than me know games in and out, whether or not they spend time gaming or it's a piece of their identity. But folks older than me, it kind of can kind of go either way. And so one big change is that people around my age are now decision makers, and so and have made good clients. But the other thing is that for older folks on the C-suite folks, they're seeing with their kids the resonance of things like Roblox, or their kids are asking them to
Yeah.
build PCs, or they saw this during the pandemic. Like they're seeing it in their kids, and like any older marketer, I'm sure I will be the same way. There's FOMO and concern that you're missing out on the next big thing. So it's taken time, but I find myself much less in a place where I'm having to convince people like games are a big deal, and it's much more like, well, is this right for our company? Is this right for my brand? How do we go about more tactically speaking? And that's
And
been a
what
big change.
and Jamin, when you get a call from either a brand or an agency on behalf of a brand, are they saying we want to participate in gaming culture, but we don't know how? Or are they looking for like media buying guidance? Just like, how do we
Yeah.
place our product in this game? Like, or what's the most common question you get? Or is it just a black box to them? And they're like, we know there's a huge opportunity, but we don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, we find like the best clients are ones that have mentally assented to the importance of games, but have not decided on a strategy. That is not often the case, but usually what happens is people come with a very specific tactic in mind. So usually it's like, hey, I want to make a video game, or hey,
Oh,
I saw X brand execution on Fortnite or Roblox or whatever it might be. I want to do something. Or hey, it seems like streamers are a big deal. I want to do something with a streamer. So we often find folks come tactically, they've decided that this is the road to reach gamers. And that often gets reinforced by other people who are in the gaming space, because they, one of the things I like about what we do is like we're agnostic. So I don't have a dog in the race. If you are, I don't know if you're someone who races dogs, I love my dog, but I would not race her. But we don't really care as much about like what the execution looks like. We just want to do what's going to be right for our audience. So
yeah.
that's what often happens is folks come in, they read about something or they see something and they're like, oh, I want to do gaming. Ergo, here is the tactic that we should use to reach gamers. And it does require a reset and be like, well, where's your audience? What are they currently doing? What are your resources? We can talk about this, but like, what does the fit look like for your company? Not every company can do something
Or
huge
not, or
on
should.
or should or should. So
Yeah.
those are the kind of like initial questions we sometimes have to walk someone back from, like, hey, look, don't make a commitment to do X, Y, and Z first. Let's step back. Let's do some research. Let's make sure we really understand like what you're capable of. And then we can start to decide like, what channels you should focus on, what a media plan might look like, those kind of more tactical questions. But
Yeah.
yeah.
When you think about your editor at the Wall Street Journal and their sort of blind spot for video games, like that person obviously had a good sense of culture. I have to assume they understood the arts, they
Yeah.
understood music, and they knew what they understand what was popular, especially being in New York at that time. What, if anything, have you talked to that person recently?
No, he will remain unnamed. You can probably figure out who
No,
it is, but
I don't mean to. I don't mean it. I don't. There's nothing I have to say that's like negative or challenging about the person. I'm just wondering if, as you outlined, new consoles that come out and new things that are happening in culture, if that person has seen the light now, or if are they still wearing blinders and saying, I don't get it. I don't know how gaming, fits into culture.
I mean, as far as media is concerned, I don't think, sadly, there's not been a lot of movement. I mean, the Washington Post just closed their video game vertical
Okay.
launcher, I believe, like last week. I mean, the Times published something. I saw this making the rounds. they had published something that was like, up until recently, gaming was well, I'm paraphrasing, but gaming was the province of children. And it's like recently, like that has not been true for, almost 3 decades.
It's
Unfortunately,
recently in like the epoch of man
yeah,
overall. Yeah.
exactly. I mean, it's such a funny, like, if being a former editorial person, that was like one of the things is like, don't be specific because they can't issue a correction. Whereas if
Right.
you use like vague language, but no, I think unfortunately, I, you know, I, I think unfortunately, certainly on the media side, it's been pretty slow to recognize that gaming is not just a commercial force, but is a commercial entity that is a culture to be studied, and that there are things that are more interesting in that space. There are a lot of reasons why I think that is, but I think there's a lot of institutional bias against games for a variety of reasons. I mean, I think the game industry has not done a good job being an ambassador at some level between themselves and the outside world.
Hmm.
In many ways, games represent the future, but as an industry, I think particularly, I mean, if I was going to point to something, really the hot coffee situation in the late 90s, that was like a real turning point, I think, for video game, where, hot coffee was there's basically this like sex mini game that was available, I believe, in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. And the founders of Rockstar, they never commented publicly. And that would have been like a real opportunity. And you can compare that to other conversations that were happening around media literacy, and particularly around like profanity and sex in other mediums, where you have creators stepping out and saying like, hey, part of what we do is we're storytellers. We should be allowed to incorporate serious adult material into our work. That's part of the process. And that's how, video games almost, didn't become a form of protected free speech for that reason. California, the state I live in, their attorney general actually sued to make video games basically like alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. The Supreme Court ruled in a 5-4 decision. Alina Kagan was actually the split vote to actually rule that video games are a protected form of free speech. So it's been like a long road. I think games have, if I was thinking in the near term, it's been a long time. I think games have not always done a great job of kind of communicating what they do, process, design-wise, to other people. If I was to think more kind of structurally about the baggage there, I think that Americans in particular have a lot of anxiety around play and leisure, and video games unearth people's professional anxieties around being taken seriously. And so, you hear people talk about when they play games, or like it's often with like guilt, or like, oh yeah, it's a time waster, or
I'm
it's
not
just
being
kind of like,
productive,
I'm not
contributing to
being
the
productive.
capitalist machine right now.
Yeah, exactly. And we just don't have that same kind of baggage around other types of things. I mean, maybe binge watching might be the closest thing, but even that, there's sort of like a kind of a self-effacing, like, oh, I binge watch, but nobody's like, you should go seek attention. You know what I mean? Whereas if I told someone like, oh yeah, I spend like 25 hours a week playing video games, they'd be like, oh my gosh, are you okay? Are you depressed? Are you like, you know what I mean? Versus like, oh, I just literally sat down on the sofa and watched 15 hours of television. I was
Right.
like, oh, that sounds like
Sounds
a fun
amazing.
week. Yeah, it sounds
Yeah.
amazing. What'd you
Yeah.
watch? So I think there's, it's both the way games have been treated by media. I think the way games have communicated what they are as an industry has not been that great. But I do think that there's a subterranean thing, particularly in the United States, around gaming, that there's that media professionals don't take it seriously because they think of it as being functionally kid stuff. And that could not be further from the truth. I wouldn't be here if that wasn't the case. But that it's getting better. Obviously, things like the Last of Us TV show and HBO Max. It's like
Yeah.
there are these things, these signposts that you can point to that are, games are being taken more seriously. At the very least, like, avoid games at your own commercial risk. So
I was going to ask about The Last of Us because I remember the groundswell of love and support for that game when it came out. I mean, people went bananas for that game and played the heck out of it and talked about playing it. And now it's the show on HBO, which is getting critical acclaim. So good for them.
yeah,
It's not easy to make an adaptation that both the fans like and is critically well received. That's hard to do in any medium. But
yeah.
I wonder, is The Last of Us breaking through because of HBO?
Yeah.
It reached one plateau as a game, and now it is having like cultural sentience that's omnipresent because
Yeah.
of a TV show.
Yeah. My theory is we're increasingly seeing like insiders, basically game making insiders, working with game loving outsiders, and then they can create something at the intersection between those two. Because yeah, you're right. There is this tension. It's been interesting seeing the takes are like, The Last of Us is good because it doesn't follow the video game to a T, or The Last of Us is bad because it doesn't follow the video game to a T.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that you have one of the folks behind Chernobyl who's ushering that along. I think HBO's imprimatur kind of
Yeah.
cuts through stuff. There's a difference between it being on HBO versus maybe being on another streamer. But
Yes.
I think from a creative standpoint, like the source material is really interesting. It already is a game that's coming in with a lot of, I think, narrative headwinds. But I really do think having someone across the table for you, and this is true in my work as well, we find the best clients are the ones that like love video games at some level. It's not an intellectual abstraction. They're not doing it because they think that there's like a, an opportunity that they're missing out on, but they have a personal connection. So we think about like my previous editor, like what were they missing? It's that personal, you have to have some kind of personal, not third, not second or third hand, like through your kids, or like, I think having some personal connection to gaming really does ultimately yield the best work. So I think that that's been the thing, that you have Neil Druckmann on the gaming side, and then you have I can't remember his name, the showrunner for the show, basically working together, and both of them
Craig
love this
Mazin,
work.
right?
Greg Mazin, yep, that's it. And and it's not like, Craig Mazin is, the other things that Craig has worked on. Chernobyl was a break from some of his previous work, but he'd played games, he loves games, and I think having that kind of interconnection really, really helps that a lot. And so whether or not Last of Us ends up being the show, wins a bunch of Emmys or whatever, but I think that model of having people on both sides of the table ultimately makes a huge, huge difference in how faithful or how good the adaptation is, because you have someone who appreciates what it is that you do, like
Yeah.
I
Yes.
just can't, it'd be hard to imagine an adaptation where one party's like kind of thinks fundamentally the thing being adapted is like kind of stupid. Like and the same thing happened, honestly, with comic book movies, the same thing, where you had people like Thomas Tull who ran Legendary
Yeah,
Pictures.
that's
I
a
mean, you
great
had people
example.
who
Yeah.
had people who love, I mean, comic book material, that stuff has been around forever, right? But you suddenly had a generation that had grown up, at this point, multiple generations that had grown up reading comic books and were like, I would love to faithfully adapt this with obviously Christopher Nolan's Batman was a big turning point, but like make a faithful adaptation for the source material from being made by people who actually like love it. And that makes a big difference at the end of the day. So I think that's what's made The Last of Us work. I mean, there are other TV shows, you have Castlevania. I mean, they're it's not the only video game adaptation out there, but that is one I think is kind of special in that way.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think if I think about your comic book example is really well taken, because how many bad versions of Marvel
Yeah,
heroes were there before they
yeah,
got, I mean, even the first bunch of Marvel cinematic universe
yeah,
films, that first Thor movie is pretty tough to watch.
yeah, yeah. The first Thor one, but then the subsequent Thor ones, I think figuring out, it's like, oh, we can.
Ragnarok is maybe my favorite one. Yeah.
Oh, it's so good. I mean, like thinking about this, it's like, oh, maybe this is through the lens of we can play with the material here, but do it in a way that is, takes advantage of the medium and also the advantage of, the Hemsworths, and it takes advantage of, it really, there's a care and love there. And then once you set a blueprint, it does make it easier for other people who maybe don't have the same kind of, like, maybe it's not their, it's not the thing that drives their creative vision, but you set a blueprint about how these things can work together. So, yeah.
And so when a brand calls you, or when anybody calls you, they want to have a talk, or they want information, they want to pick your brain, and they say, we want to be involved in gaming. What gaming do they even mean? Like, do they mean consoles? Do they mean casual gaming? Do they mean Roblox? Do they mean Minecraft specifically?
Yeah.
What do they have a central viewpoint on it, or is it just totally varies by the conversation you're having?
Yeah, no, I mean, most of the time folks don't have again, they pick something and then they're like, that's the thing that they glom onto. Whatever that thing is, over the last 10 years, it's been esports, it's been, gamification and Farmville, it's been, virtual worlds with things like World of Warcraft, and then there was Animal Crossing during the pandemic, and, now
Right.
it's Roblox and, Fortnite. And so, and all those things, there's no wrong answer there. There's not like a way to go about doing it, but we try to divide activities into people, products, and platforms. It's typically the way to sort of think about, like, if you're thinking about like where to kind of engage, those are kind of the three ways that we encourage folks to think about it. So from a platform standpoint, I mean, that's not just the consoles themselves, but that also can mean like social, basically any kind of like social universe. So
Yeah.
that's things like Discord, Twitch, The games themselves, like having a publisher or partnership capacity is really important, because if you want to do something with game makers, you need someone both on the game side, but also on your team that can interface there. And then on the people side, you have to be thinking about like, oh, how are you going to go about like reaching your audience? And so that's what we try to like sort of say, and also trying to get folks to understand that like the way that we engage each one of those does not align. Like there are places where it can fit into basically a buyer's journey, but it doesn't always map like one-to-one. So like a really good recent example is Bored Ape Yacht Club. I am not an NFT crypto person.
I knew you were going to talk about this sewer game.
Yeah. So I just a caveat here. I generally think like the fraud and corruption stuff around crypto is like a big red flag. I'm fine in theory with NFTs. I think if you want to collect things because you enjoy collecting things, that should be your motivation, but trying to flip it speculatively is very difficult. I mean, it should be maybe a piece of your portfolio, but you're not going to retire on it.
Don't go all in on monkey pictures. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, max out your 401k distribution. So I will caveat all that with this. So, they've released a video game recently called Dookie Dash, and I went to go and try and play it. And there are a bunch of things that you need to do. You have to download, basically a crypto wallet.
Yeah, you have to buy another NFT as your access pass. Yeah,
exactly. It costs $4,000 to play this thing.
Oh, that's what it's called. That's the sewer pass that you have to buy.
Yeah, the sewer pass. Yeah, exactly. So compared to like, let's say Fortnite, where I download Epic Game Store for free, and then I create a Epic Games account for free, and then I download Fortnite for free, and then I can play the game for free. What I think folks don't understand is like that the purpose of, so if you were thinking about like Donkey Dash as like an attract mechanism, very poor, right? Because only several thousand people are playing it consistently. There's all of these gates and hurdles. But if you think about it as like a loyalty mechanism or a reward mechanism, in that case, it's doing exactly, you already are bought into, it's not for people like me. That's the point. It's like, it's not for me.
No, it's a retention mechanism. Yeah,
exactly. And so getting brands to think about in that context is like, you're looking at a video game and you may be thinking like, hey, I want to do something in X video game universe as an attract mechanism. I saw this a lot with like Animal Crossing executions, where it's very difficult to do attribution. Animal Crossing has since obviously closed the doors. You can't really do brand stuff in the same way. But like these are games. They're not designed to be, generally speaking, there are exceptions where you can do diegetic advertising and things like sports games. And there's places where you can do in-game advertising, right? And so that ecosystem is becoming more developed.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, for most games, they're not designed to be like vehicles to like help drive eyeballs on what it is you're trying to do. Sometimes they really do function better as like a reward or something, a special space for people who've already bought into your brand vision. And there's lots of ways you can think about it. So trying to get folks to unpack, like when you do stuff in video games, Discord's another great example. Discord, great as a community mechanism, high lift. It's very difficult to grow a community there. You might be better off. Twitch is the same way. You might be better off drafting off of somebody else's established community there. So it's just really trying to complicate folks' picture that like one size is not going to fit all. There are choices and there are sacrifices. So when you select, gamers do not fit in one box. And sometimes choices that you make that might seem appealing to one group are going to be a big turnoff for somebody else. And you need to know what those trade-offs are. So really, it's just about muddying the waters and getting folks to think in a more complicated fashion, the way that they already do about many other things in media and marketing. It's just gaming is no different in that respect. And so you do oftentimes, I'm often in a place where I'm like, okay, I want to affirm your intent to be here, but we need to take a big step back and figure out what's the right way to approach, because you want to do this right and you want to do it for the long term. And there's not going to be a silver bullet that all of a sudden you've like reached quote unquote gamers and now you're all done. You never have to do it like ever again.
And base it on a goal instead of starting at the end with like, we want to be in that game. Like, can you just put our bag in that zombie game there? And like, well, we shouldn't do that.
Yeah, exactly. I like one of my, Mercedes-Benz did this thing with, Mario Kart a bunch of years ago where they put Mercedes-Benz, and you would think like, oh, it makes sense. It's a karting game. Let's put Mercedes-Benz, the ultimate driving machine.
Yeah.
And it was weird because it didn't fit in the universe. And also it's like the car can't be the best car, right? Because that would sort of upset the balance that exists in this gaming ecosystem. And, I guess you can say maybe you got the, the punchy sort of like the PR press and headlines, but that doesn't create like a meaningful long-term engagement.
And that's not really their brand.
It doesn't fit with your brand. And, that audience Mercedes is, when I think Mercedes, I don't think family fun. That's not like the thing I think of when I think of Mercedes. I think, premium excellence, like, there are families that drive Mercedes. Like I just that's not. I just think if you're going to do something in gaming, there's probably another place to go about doing that. Maybe if it was like Subaru or something like that, right? Like maybe there's going to be more of a crossover there. But that was one where I was like, yeah, this doesn't really.
Yeah,
This
or
doesn't really.
like Jeep, to show how rugged it is, and
Yeah,
like,
exactly,
have fun
exactly.
with it.
Yeah,
When I do, from a broad audience segmentation perspective, I've noticed more detail in games definition. There's more data available. So you used to be able to say, well, these people are, they're heavy gamers, and that
yeah,
that might be enough. Then it's like, okay, they're gamers and their platform, they're console players, and they prefer Switch over Xbox or PlayStation. Like you keep getting these slices that
yeah.
become more explanatory. Are how many how many segmentations do you see? I mean, you see the universe much more up close than I do.
Yeah.
How deep does it go?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that can be so there's pretty good like demographic data, like age, and the
Yeah,
ESA puts that out like every year. And then you often see a lot of data around gamers. It's player data. So what genres do they like? What genres they like? The thing that we've been really interested in is trying to think about like um how do we create like deeper behavioral data on gaming that's going to be relevant. One of the challenges that I think brands often have is it's twofold. One is just understanding how their audience plays games already. That's one thing we're always telling folks is like, you don't need to think of gamers, quote unquote, as being on some island far away and you need help building a boat to go get there. Like
yeah, they're already playing the game.
they're already playing games. And so you need to think about the resources and access that you already have. And sometimes that's as simple as just like either testing the waters, like on social channels, or surveying your existing audience to sort of add some complexity to like what you already know about them. The second big thing is that there are some very real messaging challenges around talking to gamers because that term gaming it's a
Yes,
complicated one. It describes, so we try to think about it in these three different ways. I love threes, but activity, identity, and affinity. And so the way we typically think about gamers is through that activity lens, like, do you play games, yes or no, and how long do you play games for? But there's also an identity piece, which is you have people who spend a lot of time playing games, but they don't self-identify as gamers. That term maybe actually have baggage for them. They don't enjoy it. They don't like being called a gamer. It summons in some contexts, if your identity doesn't match with what people's perception of what a gamer identity is, that can
yeah,
create conflict for you. But there's also an affinity piece too, which is like how much of your social interactions are driven by games. Are you involved in a board game club? Do you play games online? And so it's not an either or between those kind of three nodes, but we're trying to encourage folks to think about like, hey, look, you need to understand like your audience may have high activity, low identity, and very high affinity. And the way you think about messaging things may mean activating how they play and who they play it with, but
right.
not calling them gamers or using any of the stereotypical language that you might use. So that's the thing. It's going to be different. I'm a great example. I love playing video games. I have a 12-month, 1-year-old. She turns 1 in just about 2 weeks. I love
Congratulations.
playing video games. I have significantly less time, and I also would not consider myself. I don't call myself a gamer in that way because I don't think I align with maybe some of the identity markers. But activity wise would
Interesting.
be a lot higher. But for me, affinity wise, that's what I spend time talking with my friends about. I love gaming. Like it's a big piece of my life. Obviously, I've started a business around it. But if you just went from like how many hours a week are you playing video games, I would not meet the mark of someone who would be considered a heavy gamer, even though the types of games that I play, what I know about gaming, how I think of myself would 100% make me susceptible to being marketed to as basically as a game playing self. And so you do have to, it's complicated. And I do think that there is a tension that I think will get resolved over time, and that you have an audience of people who does the thing that they say that they do, but they don't like being called that. And that is unique, I would say, to gaming compared to other things.
Yeah. Well, I think there's any monolithic, description of a group is dangerous uh, for the person making that claim. I think we've learned that over time. But in gaming, there's so many avenues and so many ways to play, engage, express yourself. Even you, as you're not
Yeah.
playing as much, you're still as engaged in gaming
Yeah.
through a number of different, areas of your life. And
Yep.
professionalism is
Absolutely.
one of those ways.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the other big piece is like half the market is mobile, right? So like if you look dollars, I mean, Activision's a good example where you look at like Activision, their core business is heavily driven by their acquisition of King, which does Candy Crush, and that
Yes.
constitutes a non-trivial portion of food. And we think of Activision as being like, oh, that's the Call of Duty company, or that's the Blizzard company that does
Right.
like Warcraft and Overwatch. It's like, no, that's like a social games publisher. That's like a big piece, is the biggest piece of their business is on the mobile side. And so that's just like that's one huge arena that I see brands often like don't even think about is, and the way you market on mobile 100% different. There are ad networks, but they tend to be heavily skewed towards marketing video games and
Yeah.
driving installs. And so like the audience that plays that is very different. So it just I think when we're talking about gaming at this point it is a culture, and then it requires an analysis of the subcultures underneath it. And your challenge is to really figure out like what is the subculture that you should be tapping into, where are your people, where's your tribe, because there is one for everybody. You just gotta go out and find it.
Yeah. And I mean, if you look at how a mobile gamer who's like a king player versus or compared to a platform player that's playing games like Overwatch or like traditional, esports, those are different people.
Yep.
And the way
Yeah,
they share is different. The way they think about the games is different. It's like it's a totally different part of your life, or maybe not even considered part of your life. It's just like I'm in line for the dentist.
yeah,
So I can bust out five levels of Candy Crush right now.
yeah,
And it's
yeah,
like
yeah,
that's as
exactly.
valuable time spent as the person playing Overwatch.
100%. Yeah, I mean, what do you call someone? It's like a Wordle player that opens the app up every single day. They spend time, maybe it's like 5 minutes, it could be 20, 25 minutes.
Great
They do it
example.
literally every single day. Every
Yes.
single day. It's not a social game. So you're not playing with other people. It's a private experience that you're doing by yourself, but you're spending, 5, 6 hours a week on
And
something like that. And then the social aspect might be, sharing your, how whether you did it in 2 rows or 3 rows or whatever it might be. That's the sort of the limit to, but there's not a lot of, there's not active like Discord communities around like Wordle strategy, or what I mean? Like it doesn't, versus someone who's primarily a competitive player, but maybe only plays like, 2 or 3 hours a week, and they pop on with their friends once a week. So for certain types of
yes.
games that require 5 or 6 people, and so getting together to do that is like a big time investment. You get 1 day a week, you play for 3 hours, and then that's it. Like the way you talk to those people are really really different, and people have different life stage considerations as well. And so yeah, it's a really fun, I mean, it's part of the reason I'm interested in the space is because of the complexities there, and there's so much that's not really understood. So to be part of shaping something, even in a small way is has been really exciting for me over the last decade plus.
When you look at something like Wordle, do you it because that's a great example of how it blows up your notion of what a gamer is. I don't think most players of Wordle would consider
Yeah,
themselves gamers to your
yeah,
earlier
no,
point.
yeah.
How do you look at it as expanding the market for gaming? Is like are there more games like Wordle that help drag gaming into pop culture and into dominant culture overall?
Yeah, I mean, I would say like one of the places I'm most excited about is non-gaming brands dipping their toe into gaming. So they're going to do it clumsily at first, but whether that's Netflix, for example, like making investments in
Yes,
games, or the New York Times, they probably don't think of themselves as a games publisher, but a
they
hundred
sure
percent
are. Yeah,
spelling bee, Wordle, like they know what the retention figures are. They know
going
that this
going back
drives.
to the crossword. Yeah,
Exactly. Going back to the crossword, they know what the purpose of those things can be from a retention standpoint. They know both from a retention standpoint, but also this is a way to get people who maybe don't read the New York Times and get them to pay for a New York Times subscription, which they can then use to fund all the journalism. I mean, they could. I think that kind of stuff really, even if the even if the numbers, even if the numbers are such that we're moving every day, we're moving out of a world where people ask, "Do you play video games?" and into this world where people ask, "What games do you play?" I do think
that's
that the
nice.
value of having someone like New York Times make investments in gaming is really at the sort of, you think about gaming at the brand level. That's what it helps kind of like cut through. It helps explode definitions. It helps create context in which maybe people who would not necessarily think of themselves as gamers are engaging with games on a daily basis. Which, frankly, it's always been that way. It was bridge or pinochle or bowling, or like people have
Right.
always been playing games together. But I think helping people think of themselves as someone who has a daily practice of playing games is really, really helpful. Is really, really helpful in the long term. in the aggregate. So I'm always watching for those kind of opportunities when you have non-game companies. They're like, hey, look, this is where our activity is. Because when Reed Hastings, who was the obviously chairman, but was the co-CEO of Netflix, is like, hey, look, our competition is not other streamers. Our competition is things like Fortnite. They understand that like that's what's driving attention right now, and so I think that that's a place where the more you have non-gaming companies also being a part of that play space, I think that's generally great for everyone and builds on top of the gains that game makers have already driven over the last 30, 40 years.
That's awesome. Jamin, thank you so much for making time for me. It's been really great talking to you.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Where can people find you online?
LinkedIn is the best way. So just Jamin Warren. I encourage people to find me on LinkedIn, or you can go to 256.co, and we have a bi-weekly newsletter that we send out. We cover games and marketing there, but I'd say those are probably the two best places to get in touch with me.
Awesome. I will add links to both in the show notes. Thanks again. I really appreciate it.
Amazing. Thanks, Adam.
See ya. If you have an idea, question, or you want to push back on something you hear in the episode, go to that'snotaninsight.com and leave a message or voicemail for me. The best and most interesting messages will be added to future episodes. The Strategy Inside Everything is produced by me, Adam Pierno. If you like what you've heard, leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Actually, I have no idea if that helps or if it's ever done anybody any good. If you really want to help the show and you liked what you heard, share it with someone else who you think will get something out of it. That's the best way to help the show and keep the conversation growing. New music for The Strategy Inside Everything is by Luke Halaisna. You can learn more at halaisna.com. If you like what you're listening to, you can also go to Luke's Patreon and make a donation. It's at patreon.com/Halaisna. Find links to both in the show notes. If you want to learn more about your host, Adam Pierno, you can find it on adampierno.com. Learn about my books, speaking, and consulting practice. Thanks so much for listening.